Art in Africa, like music and like traditional religion, is an essential tool to help us understand the history of the continent. From rock paintings to wood sculptures, from terracotta pots to bronze masks, all give us a unique insight into the past.
These works were not made as art for art's sake as they are in the West. They're really art made for life's sake. They played a very important role in the lives of the people who made them. They were not meant for museums. They were handled, they were fondled, they were part of the entire society.
Artwork records many of the great events in Africa: foreign invasions, royal ceremonies, religious worship. But art also gives us a window into the small domestic details of day-to-day life.
The Story of Africa, History from an African Perspective. Part 12, The Art of Ife and Benin, presented by Hugh Kwashi.
Africa, 900 years ago. A great power, a cultured people. In the kingdom of Ife, now in Nigeria, a rich tradition of sculpture flourished, unlike anything in Africa or Europe at the time. These are works of technical sophistication, magnificent craftsmanship, and astonishing natural beauty. Come to the British Museum and connect with the humanity, the mystery, and the art of Ife.
Ile-Ife in southwest Nigeria is the sacred city of the Yoruba. According to traditional belief, it was founded by Oduduwa, the son of Olorun, god of the sky, and became a powerful cultural and spiritual center. The art of Ife dates from around the 12th to the 15th century, though the earliest pieces may be much older. It is made up of work in terracotta, bronze, and stone. Some of the sculptures are heads or busts of human figures, others of animals.
The naturalistic pieces of Ife are truly the most naturalistic African art pieces you can find. They cannot be ignored.
Dr. Ohioma Pogosun, lecturer in art history in the African Institute at the University of Ibadan.
Well, naturalistic, that is a true representation of human and animal forms, and it was comparable to that of classical Greek and Renaissance Rome, for example. And so the earliest Westerners to interact with Ife art originally thought that they were not works of art of black people.
There are different classes of chieftaincy in Ife. You have the hereditary one, and you have those who are chosen because of their bravery and so on. We have honorary title chiefs, and that one is chosen because of his contribution to society either in Ife or all over the world.
The way these objects are now being showcased is going to rekindle our belief, that if an object has been existing, or we find an object 11th century, 12th century, how did they get there? These are the questions we should now be asking. Who were the people there? And with this exhibition, it's going to bring out more curiosity. People want to find out what is actually happening.
This astonishing sculpture in gleaming copper represents one of the rulers, or Oni, of the Kingdom of Ife in western Nigeria 7 or 8 centuries ago. And yet when these superb sculptures first came to the attention of Europeans, only as recently as 1910, the experts at once pronounced that Africans could never have conceived or made them, and that some wandering European must have been the artist. Now the world knows better. The truth is that these are portraits of African kings made by African artists for use in royal ceremonial.
What's important about these ones is they're full standing figures. They show the Oni, or the king of Ife, at the moment of coronation. So he's wearing a crown, he's holding a horn with medicine in his hand, and he has a staff in the other hand, and he has this regalia of red parrot feathers on his chest.
Why are these images so important?
They're so important because they're equivalent to the medieval sculptures in cathedrals today. So if you look for the image of Henry VII or of Richard II, these are the same date, and yet they have much more detail, they have much more humanity, and they have much more individuality than the sculptures being done in Gothic and early modern Britain.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The head of Ife is 3/4 life-size and named after the town of Ile-Ife in Nigeria, where it was dug up nearly 70 years ago. It's hollow and made of leaded brass about 1 centimeter thick. The head wears a crown that was originally painted red. Over the centuries, the once shining brass face has taken on a natural green patina. The head of Ife is thought to be as much as 800 years old.
This object over here was the first object from Ife to enter a museum collection. It came to the British Museum. It's one of 2 objects from the British Museum in the exhibition, and it came here in 1896, and it is a quartz or quartzite stool or throne, and it shows an enormous elephant trunk, and on it would have sat the Oni, or the king of Ife, with his legs astride the elephant trunk and his feet on a stool, because of course if he was king he mustn't touch the ground.
Early excavations of Ife sculptures were carried out by the German ethnologist Leo Frobenius. On finding brass and terracotta heads in the Olokon Grove in Ife in 1910, he was astounded by the quality of the artwork, describing it as
eloquent, of a symmetry, a vitality, a delicacy of form directly reminiscent of ancient Greece.
But, he continued,
it is proof that once upon a time a race far superior to the Negro had settled here.
Like many other Europeans at that time, Frobenius simply couldn't accept that such art could be of African origin. Indeed, he found it more probable that the sculptures had come from the mythical lost Greek colony of Atlantis. This, despite the fact that the sculptures clearly depicted black African features. Although it was the naturalistic faces that had impressed many Westerners, the Ife craftsmen had also produced other heads that were conical and much more abstract. Professor Roland Abiodun.
It meant that there were 2 types of head: the outer naturalistic head and the inner spiritual head. The inner spiritual head is the one that is more important and more powerful than the outer spiritual head, which is why the Yoruba always pray that may your inner head not spoil your outer head.
According to the Yoruba myth, one of the sons of the deity Oduduwa left Ife to found his own kingdom in Benin.
Ife antiquities first really came to light in 1910. What happened was that a German adventurer and anthropologist called Leo Frobenius had heard about the mythic kingdom of Ife, and he decided in 1908 to go there. He went there in 1910. He took a man called Martius with him. They spent 3 weeks there. They got a team of Africans. They burrowed into the sacred grove underneath the ground. They found terracottas. For the first time you have here a cast of a terracotta head found in 1910, the original in Berlin, back together with the original headdress which is still in Nigeria.
For a few weeks in 1910, Frobenius carried out excavations and unearthed many terracotta and stone heads. But he was also shown a brass head, which he was told was Olokun, the Yoruba god of the sea. He photographed it for his book, The Voice of Africa. It bears a striking resemblance to the head of Ife in the British Museum.
He thought it was of Greek or ancient European origin. He identified it with Poseidon, with the god of the sea. He identified the kingdom of Ife with the lost kingdom of Atlantis. And he wrote all of this up, and indeed it was published in the Illustrated London News over there in 1910. What happened in order to disprove all of this was over there where those people are two small brasses excavated in 1939 by Thurston Shaw, Igbo Ukwe brasses. One is of an elephant head, and those are about 1,000 years old. And they proved that this was an autonomous African tradition.
Ibuku, a town in the southeastern Nigerian state of Anambra, is notable for 3 archaeological sites where bronze artifacts from a highly sophisticated bronze metal working culture dating back to the 9th and 10th centuries was found during excavations. These artifacts are believed to have existed long before other known bronze artifacts such as Ife bronze in Osun State and Benin bronze in Edo State.
The art of Africa finds expression in such diverse activities as weaving, basketry, beadwork and jewelry. But it is in sculpture that the continent is often viewed as having excelled. And it is from Nigeria that some of the most extraordinary artwork has emerged. Around 900 BC, there appeared a form of pottery named after Nok, the village where the first discoveries were made, midway between modern-day Abuja and Jos. Faces and heads carved in terracotta or baked clay are extraordinary in their detail and delicacy. We know little about the Nok people or how their society was organized, so this artwork is a tantalizing glimpse into their history.
Nok culture here was beginning to build full-size figures. It was able to tell us exactly what people look like, what warriors look like, what headdresses they wore, what coiffure the women wore.
It's clear this culture, which flourished until about 200 AD, was artistically and technologically sophisticated.
The sight of the brass Olokun head threw Leo Frobenius into a state of utter confusion. He simply couldn't believe that the people of Ife had ever been capable of making such a sophisticated object.
Closer to me is the cast of the head which Leo Frobenius was shown in 1910, which is called the Olokun head. And the second is the original head, which is in the British Museum. As you can see, both heads are done according to the same aesthetic traditions. The treatment of the face, the nose, the lips are made in the same way. The treatment of the ethnic marks are the same also on the face. They indicate the same tradition of producing brass heads.
In January 1938, a man started digging the foundations for a new house in this compound, not far from the royal palace of the king, or Oni of Ife. As the work progressed on this site, a total of 18 sculptures were unearthed. Many were lying just a few feet below the surface, and one of them was the head now in the British Museum.
Well, you can really say that the Ife metal heads were discovered twice. They were discovered for the first time by Frobenius in 1910. That was somehow forgotten, and then they were rediscovered again in the late 1930s.
This sensational and unexpected new find was reported with great enthusiasm by an American anthropologist, William Bascom, for the Illustrated London News. Such was the high quality of the work that he likened the unknown people who made them to the great Italian Renaissance sculptor, Donatello. He wrote, "Little that Italy, Greece, or Egypt ever produced could be finer, and the appeal of their beauty is immediate and universal." Most of the heads unearthed in 1938 remained with the Oni of Ife. These are casts of some of them held in the British Museum collection. The sight of such a large group of refined naturalistic work had a profound effect on Europeans, but the idea still persisted that they couldn't be the work of Africans. In his article, William Bascom wrote, "How in a comparatively obscure corner of this vast and backward continent could an art and a technique have flowered that take their stand beside the best ever evolved by the elaborate civilizations of Europe and Asia?"
Look at the collection here, at the artifacts. They are mostly heads. What is the fascination with the heads?
That's a good question. In the Yoruba kingdom, we believe the head is where authority comes from. So let me put it that way, the leader is the center of power. And we believe authority is in the head and it's in the mouth.
Ife was preoccupied with religion, with ritual. And most of this represented the Ife cosmology of the head as the center of power. And the head defined you. You didn't define, the body did not define the head. The head is an entity unto itself. The fact that we're seeing so many heads here is something to do with that religious belief within the Ife setting at the time.
Before its decline, Ife was a cosmopolitan city, and you will see so many heads and faces showing different groups who existed in Ife.
In the Yoruba tradition and legendary stories, Ife came to be as the divine establishment of God, who sent one of his messengers, Oduduwa, to establish the land over water. He came with a chicken and with a bowl of sand. The sand was spread on water, and a chicken was kept on the little sand. And as the chicken scatters the sand, land emerged from the water, and that is what is called Ile Ife.
There's a particular story associated with this terracotta head. It's said to represent Lajua, a chief attendant to the Oni, Awurukulukin. When his master died, Lajua decided to conceal the king's death by adopting his regalia and his identity himself. Lajua was later put to death for his treachery, but he has since become a celebrated figure. Professor John Picton.
The neck of the figure has a number of lines around it, which probably represent those little rings of fat that a well-tended body tends to have in West Africa as a result of a decent diet. And they are, in the recent past, as we know, a sign of beauty in both men and women.
For some time, all the good things which were discovered in Africa was believed not to have been made by Africans. Fortunately, we have moved far away from that. If we consider the time when this was made in Europe, it is still Middle Age, and the aesthetics of these heads are even far beyond many things which were produced in Europe at that time.
It wasn't just that Europeans couldn't believe that Africans had the artistic sensibility to create such an object as the head of Ife. They couldn't believe either that Africans had the technological know-how to cast it. The head of Ife was made using the lost wax process, now known to have been practiced in West Africa for centuries before the first Europeans set foot there.
The artist would have started with a clay core, probably with some animal dung, perhaps some cereal husk in there as well. Once the clay core was modelled into a roughly human head shape, sheets of beeswax would have been modelled onto that of a known thickness. And a lot of the Ife heads are cast incredibly finely, so the thinness of the wax, which was probably also a relatively valuable material, would have been important. And this would have been modelled to give all the detail that the final metal casting should have. Having done that, he would enclose the whole wax and structure with this same clay dung sand mixture, very carefully pushed into all the detail that was in the head. And it's how well he pushes the mixture into the wax, how well the bronze will actually cast.
The clay surround with the head inside would then have been heated and the wax melted out. In the traditional lost wax process, molten metal is then poured into the space that's been left. But the head of Ife has a secret. It was probably cast using a variation of this technique.
The open pouring of metal tends to be a much later development in Africa. The early West African tradition seems to all have been the enclosed crucible. So what the Ife artist would have done is he would have attached these casting channels, rods of wax, and they would have come to a cup at the top. But in West Africa they actually put the chips of metal into this space here. They then put an old shard of pottery over the top to protect it and enclosed the whole mould like that, so that the metal was already enclosed in the mould. The mould could then be put in a fire, the wax melted out of it, and with a little drain hole that's there, drains all the wax out, that gets plugged, and then the fire's built up in temperature until all these little chips of metal here melt and they flow down into the space where the wax was and fill it up, and hey presto, you've got your bronze.
The general quality of the casting is quite excellent. The metal clearly flowed through all the parts of the mould, including the intricacies of the details on the headdress or crown, and more especially where you look at this, it really is just a one-piece, one-off casting with very little in the way of necessary repairs afterwards where the metal didn't flow or the mould collapsed or something like that, which honestly is a very common fault. If you have a look at your average Greek or Roman equivalent bronze head, then you'll find repairs and all over them.
In the 1980s, the head of Ife was analysed by metal scientists at the British Museum. 2 small samples were drilled from the head, one from the neck and the other from the crown. The results of the analysis not only determined the composition of the alloy used, but also gave an indication of how the head was actually cast.
When we took samples from the head, we were hoping to be able to try and find out more about the casting conditions. This particular alloy is of copper and zinc and lead, but if the metal is molten, then of course the dense droplets of lead have time to sink through the molten brass and concentrate at the bottom. And what we found was there is about 11.8% of lead in the neck of the sample and about 10.8 in the top of the head. Now this may not seem very much, but it is significant. It does show that the head was cast upright, and secondly, it does suggest that the metal was molten in the mould for, I would guess, 2 or 3 minutes to give the time for that amount of segregation to take place, which once again is a sign of a pretty proficient casting. The guy who cast that knew what he was doing.
Analysis of the head also showed that the brass from which it was fashioned was probably imported from thousands of miles away, across the Sahara Desert.
Many years ago, The remains of a caravan was found that clearly had lost its way. It was carbon dated to the 12th century, the bones of the camels, and it was perfectly preserved in the dry conditions, and amongst it was bundles and bundles of brass rods, and these brass rods have very much the same composition as the Ife head, and so this is a probable source of the metal.
I think there's no doubt that that head in the British Museum is the image of an Oni. The headdress and everything that we know suggests that.
This is a person who is aware about his power and about what he can achieve in this world. He knows that he's a great man and very sure of his power and his influence. It's a royal attitude.
The Onis of Ife had every reason to be sure of their power and influence. For the Yoruba people, the Oni was not just a king, he was a deity. And according to Yoruba mythology, the city of Ile-Ife, where he held court, was the place where the gods descended from the sky and created the world. The Oni claimed direct descent from Oduduwa, the founding god of the Yoruba kingdom. And the supreme status of this man is shown by the fact that he is wearing a crown decorated with beads, a sign of his nobility and wealth.
The beads in the crown mean that this was a very high personality. The crown was certainly a composite structure. It is possible that the base was cotton woven cap, maybe in the style of what we see now. We have some photographs of that as well. And if you look at the top of the crown, you can see these elements which are beads. The beads were produced in Ile-Ife for a long period before the European came, and we know that they were making red tubular beads. And probably in the British Museum head, what you can find here, this painted in red, suggests the red tubular beads.
The huge significance of beads in Ife society can be seen in another brass sculpture dug up at the same time as the head of Ife. It shows a half figure, again interpreted as an Oni. He not only wears a beaded crown, but he's bedecked in intricate beaded regalia. In 1948, the sculptures unearthed 10 years earlier were reunited and put on display at the British Museum.
South from Ife and near the coast, there flourished the ancient city and empire of Benin. This old print, following a Dutchman's visit in about 1620, shows the King of Benin riding out to receive the plaudits of his people.
The first Portuguese visitors had brought back many stories of the Oba's military might, and thought him so powerful that they took back an ambassador to Lisbon to be received by the King of Portugal. The Oba was a human god, so sacred that no commoner could look in his face. On the few occasions he left his palace, he was preceded by musicians and leopards, the symbols of his power. He owned dwarfs, just as European kings did at that time.
I'll travel to modern-day Nigeria, where the Kingdom of Benin reached its height in the 16th century. The center of power of the Kingdom of Benin was Benin City. Today it's one of Nigeria's thriving cities, home to over 1 million Africans. The main circle in the center is dotted with statues, public art depicting Benin's history. For 600 years, until the late 19th century, it dominated this part of West Africa. But the kingdom's former scale and power are not immediately obvious, unless you know where to look. Dr. Ekagusa Isian, author of several books on Benin's history, is taking me to see a 500-year-old feat of engineering. At the kingdom's height in the 16th century, a series of moats and earthen walls protected the city and its surrounding land.
It was a defensive system that consisted of a ditch and then a rampart.
What little survives is overgrown and barely recognizable. But archaeologists have found evidence of a vast network of trenches and walls, up to 9 meters high. They zigzagged around the city area for an incredible 4,000 miles.
Benin really was the capital of this part of Africa. That is the eastern part of the west coast of Africa. Benin was the principal town. It was an important center of the culture of this part of Africa. It was an important center of the political reach along this huge area of the eastern portion of the west coast of Africa.
The kingdom was governed from a vast palace by a hereditary ruler, the Oba. And his subjects were animists, believers in the idea that souls and spirits existed not only in humans, but in animals, plants, and the earth itself. At its height, it exerted political, military, and economic control over an area stretching almost 40,000 square miles.
Benin artists, beginning at least as early as 1400, had long been developing their own styles and techniques, styles that were entirely African in inspiration and execution. They have their place today among the artistic masterpieces of the world. This ivory armlet places the king where he belonged in Benin society, at the center of all things. Plaques in brass, which once adorned the walls of the Oba's palace, reinforce the power and mystery of the king. A visitor from Holland to the King of Benin in about 1600 wrote this report.
The city is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and wide. The houses are arranged in good order. The people are in no way inferior to the Dutch in cleanliness. Their houses are as polished as a looking glass. They have good laws and efficient police, and show us 1,000 marks of friendship.
The Oba, king of men, could handle leopards, the kings of the forest, like toys. From his waist sprang mudfish, symbols of power over sea and river, whose guardian was Olokun, archangel of the waters. The king had great authority, but this depended on the support of noblemen and appointed chiefs, and on certain persons of ritual power. Among these were the Queen Mothers of Benin, one of whom is shown in this memorable head, sculpted in about 1550. Adjoining Benin was the ancient empire of the Yoruba people, with its heart in the city of Oyo. The Yoruba developed great military strength based on cavalry.
Production of art in Benin, capital of the Edo Kingdom, appears to have started around the 15th century, although it's been suggested that the kingdom, and possibly its art, was in fact much older. Most of the work is in bronze, though ivory, terracotta and wood were also used. The sculptures are often termed court art, commissioned by and produced for the Obas or kings. Throughout its history, the African continent has produced distinctive art forms, from the rock art of the San of the Kalahari and the Saharan Berbers, the throwing knives of the Congo, the wooden stools of the Ashanti, the masks of the Dogon. hugely diverse and highly sophisticated art forms which have evolved over thousands of years. Just as the griots of Mali preserve their history through oral rendition, so too does art take on the vital function of communication within societies which do not rely on the written word. Dr. Omotoshu Eluyemi is the Director of National Museums and Monuments in Nigeria.
It's our form of history book. Even in those days, when writing was not known in Yoruba land, our artworks go to tell people of what stage of history we are, how history is written, how history is being documented.
The Oba was responsible for maintaining the guilds of bronzesmiths, woodcarvers, and beadworkers. He commissioned the artwork, which is for the glorification of the kings and the veneration of royal ancestors. The Benin craftsmen did not limit themselves to sculpting busts and faces. They also designed intricate plaques, which recorded the day-to-day activities of the court and kingdom.
Many of the stories of Africa are told here, the British Museum in London. This is where thousands of artifacts, collected, bought, and taken from the continent, ended up. When they were first discovered, objects from the ancient kingdoms of West Africa stunned the world. None more so than these extraordinary plaques. They came from what was once the Kingdom of Benin and are around 500 years old. When the British came upon these objects in 1897, they thought there's no way they could have been created by Africans. They were amazed at the detail and the intricacy. They were seen as being something completely revolutionary to the British, and you can understand why. These aren't carvings. They're 16th century casts in copper-rich alloys of brass and bronze. Over 900 plaques are thought to have been made. To produce each one, the artist would need to know how to make and fire a clay mold, and how to melt the metals to pour into it. It's an incredibly difficult skill to master. The combination of relatively sophisticated science and artistic accomplishment baffled most European 19th century observers. They couldn't believe that so-called primitives had been capable of producing work of the same standard as their European contemporaries. These amazing objects just didn't match the Europeans' view of West Africans.
Those bronzes were not made for museum pieces. Initially, in the absence of photography and writing, they were made to depict, illustrate events in the palace or in the community or some festivals. That's why you see them. They were made as, in the absence of photography. That's what they were meant for initially.
Ces plaques en bronze, elles sont tout à fait étonnantes à différents niveaux, parce que d'abord, ce sont des formes d'œuvres qui sont tout à fait uniques en Afrique, où on ne pratique pas ce genre de bas-relief.
That's an artistic point, but the plaques also contain anthropological information.
Ces plaques font l'apologie de l'Oba, mais aussi de ses dignitaires, d'un certain nombre de rituels, d'un certain nombre d'actions, qui sont véritablement une archive historique qui vient se superposer, s'additionner à l'archive orale, puisqu'il n'y a pas d'écriture.
This plaque shows 3 African traders. They're holding manillas, the currency that was used for trade with Europe. The next plaque along shows their Portuguese trading partners, and they're not short of a manila or two. This salt cellar is presented as an object to be admired, not just explained. It's been given an aesthetic value that reaches beyond its historical context. This leopard can be seen as a piece of art, but originally it was used for carrying water. Seeing it purely as a sculpture could strip it of its meaning within the culture where it was created.
Many French still assume that they have this vision of African cultures as essentially tribal, relatively unhierarchical, relatively without centralized power and so forth. Showing Benin is a good way also of rectifying or correcting this skewed view of African cultures in the French public.
These bronze pieces, and some 2,000 others like them, arrived in Europe in 1897, and they created a sensation. For they were so accomplished and so unlike the wooden masks and fetishes that explorers had brought back from Africa before them, that many people said that they could not be purely African in origin. And today, the treasure of Benin is dispersed among museums and collections all over the world, in Britain and America, Germany, Russia, Switzerland, Sweden, France, and Australia. The second biggest collection is now back in Nigeria, but none of the objects have returned to the place from which they were taken, the palace of the Oba of Benin. The plaques, about 1,000 of them, were found by the punitive expedition stacked in a storeroom. Apparently they had been taken down some 200 years before. Once they had covered the pillars of the palace, and together they give a detailed picture of the Benin court at the height of its glory and power. On the few occasions that the Oba left his palace, his sacred body had to be protected from the rays of the sun by the shields of his chiefs. His attendants, going before him, carry leather caskets containing kola nuts for the Oba to distribute as a gesture of patronage. Until the end of the 16th century, metal was in such short supply that the craftsmen were extremely sparing with it. The bronze of the earliest pieces is of eggshell thinness, and the delicacy with which the original wax was modelled and covered in clay was so great that little filing was necessary. So the disciplines imposed by a scarcity of metal contributed to the development of a style which surely represents one of the high watermarks of sculptural inspiration in all Africa. One of the most technically accomplished of all the plaques, a masterpiece of bronze caster's art in high relief. It shows the Oba fulfilling his sacred duties by sacrificing a cow. The roof of the palace at that time was surmounted by a huge bronze bird. Below it, a great python, also of bronze, sprawls down over the wooden shingles. The pillars supporting the roof were covered with plaques, and the entrance to the palace was permanently guarded by warriors. One Oba was said to be able to raise an army of 100,000 men within 24 hours. Many plaques record their victories. This is a prisoner with a brutal sword wound across his chest. The scars on this man's face show him to be an Igbo from one of the tribes to the east of Benin with whom the Bini had many wars.
Reminders of the quality craftsmanship once commissioned by the king now lie in Benin's City Museum. These are, sadly, mostly replicas of bronzes that were taken from here in 1897. But even so, I'm struck once again by the intricacy of these objects. It's always the detail that shocks me when I look at these Benin plaques. I mean, the whole thing is very much like a historical document as much as a piece of art. I mean, this is depicting very particular people, and you can imagine them in all of their finery, because you can see it actually depicted here, the detail of the textiles, the layered textiles that they're wearing.
Many bronzes depict 16th century obas, and they are records of specific events, such as military victories which expanded the kingdom.
This, for me, will be Oba Essegi returning from fighting the Agana triumphant with his retinue.
Oba Essegi bolstered the kingdom with the help of the Portuguese, who provided weapons and mercenaries for battles. Many of the plaques were made during his reign. The Portuguese also brought the metal, which enabled the bronze casters to immortalize his exploits. But this craft predates the arrival of the Portuguese, so there must have been another source of copper for the bronzesmiths.
When this plaque was made, the Portuguese had been in touch with the kingdom for something like a century, and they too appear on the plaques. They're shown with such accuracy that it's possible to date them from the details of their clothing. This man must have been in Benin in the early 16th century. He's armed with an elegant sword, but the Portuguese had more advanced and effective weapons than that. They brought cannons and muskets, the first guns that the Bini had seen, and they had crossbows. The Oba persuaded them to join his army, and with them on his side he became one of the most powerful rulers in West Africa, conquering an empire that stretched for 200 miles along the coast from the frontier of present-day Dahomey to the banks of the Niger River. The Portuguese were seeking ivory, pepper, and above all, slaves. The Oba supplied them, and in exchange obtained metal. One of the attendants waiting on this chief carries what was to become the standard currency on the coast, a European-made ingot of bronze, a manila.
It was at the end of the 19th century that Europeans first began to take a serious interest in the art of Africa. In 1897, over 2,000 works of art were removed from Benin City in Nigeria after the city was destroyed by British troops. The Benin bronzes stunned Europeans who saw them.
People worried long and hard about the Benin bronzes. Could they really have been made by Africans? Were they actually made by Portuguese for them? We now know, of course, that they were made by Africans, and that casting tradition stretches back long, long before European influence. But at the time, they changed, very importantly, our preconceptions about what African art was and what Africans were like.
But the people who made these majestic sculptures, dating from the 16th to the 19th century, were relative newcomers in the art and craft of casting metal. Their oral traditions told them that they had learned their skills from the Yoruba people of Ife, about 100 miles away to the northwest. In fact, this Benin bronze of a man on horseback has been interpreted as a metalsmith from Ife, bringing the knowledge of casting techniques to the people of Benin.
European experts might argue about the origin of this superb technique, but to the Bini there is no mystery. Their traditions state that it was taught to them by bronze casters from the sacred city of Ife, to which the kings of Benin paid homage. But no one in Ife today casts bronzes, and there's little solid evidence that anyone ever did, until in 1938, digging the foundations for his house, a man discovered 18 superb bronze heads. They were lying close to the palace of the king, the One of Ife. Archaeological evidence suggests that these bronzes were made several centuries before the Portuguese arrival in West Africa, perhaps as early as the 12th century. So wherever else the tradition has its roots, it's not in 15th century Portugal. But were they also the inspiration for the bronzes of Benin? There is more than tribal tradition to link the two. This little figure was dug up in the palace in Benin, but from the regalia on its chest, it can be recognized as an image of the One of Ife in full ceremonial robes. and exactly the same regalia is modelled on one of the bronzes that was found in Ife itself. So here, almost certainly, is the source of the techniques and traditions of the bronze casters of Benin. But to see these lovely things, you have to come to Africa, for all but one of them lie here in the country of their origin. Unlike their descendants, the Benin bronzes, which, as a result of that rash expedition by Vice-Consul Phillips back in 1897, are still scattered throughout the world.
Some of the plaques show chiefs, like the one on the upper left. These are all items from our collection here that will be in our exhibition. Others were worn by chiefs, such as that bronze cuff on the upper right, or the hip pendant there at the lower right. Others were carried, like the bird you see at the lower left, in ceremonies by chiefs, and some were personal items, like that wooden box at the bottom. That actually is meant to hold kola nuts, and the chiefs present them to visitors to their homes as an act of hospitality, and have a number of varied forms that these take. This is a mudfish, a very popular motif in Benin. It's a kind of, it's a sort of a variation of a catfish that can move on both land and water, and is seen as an apt reminder of people that can move from the supernatural world to the world of the living. In both past and present, the palace has been a real center of activities for Benin. There at the left, a 16th century plaque that shows a number of courtiers in front of one of the shrine areas. You can see the shingled roof and the tower with the snake coming down. It was destroyed in 1897 and rebuilt 17 years later. It's had several additions since then, but it is still primarily an earthen building. Many of the chiefs and inhabitants of Benin, in fact, have suggested that a new building be built for the Oba, for the king. But he himself wants this kept as it is because he feels a tie with the past in it. On the left is a plaque not from our collection, but showing a chief from a 16th century work holding a ceremonial sword, and you can see he has a feather coming from the left-hand side of a beaded headband that he wears. He has a very high beaded collar that's covering his chin, and he has a strand of beads running from one shoulder to another. These, as well as beads at his ankles and brass armlets at his wrist. Every chief will get the sword. That is a symbol that is shared by them and by the Oba. It's one of the royal emblems. But the other elements are not shared by everyone. That high collar, for instance. You can see at the upper right a chief wearing the high collar as well as the headband and feather. But the lower photo shows a half collar, a much shorter one. So everyone can see at a glance whether you're entitled to either one, because not all chiefs get to wear the collar at all. So are you a half collar chief or a full collar chief? Some of the costumes that are still worn today actually have origins that go back 500 years. 16th century plaque from the British Museum shows chiefs, as you can see, in a kind of scalloped attire. It would have been red. This is a special cloth called ododo that was imported by the Portuguese who first contacted Benin in the late 15th century. Their high hats with brass ornaments also still worn, and you can see them with that eben. That sword is the symbol par excellence for the chiefs. And we have the highest ranking chiefs only are allowed to wear that kind of attire. Here at the right, another set of chiefs, two who are the only ones in the kingdom who are entitled to wear a red hat made out of that same cloth with brass ornaments that has this high protrusion. At the left is one of our objects, probably 18th century, possibly earlier. It originally showed all three figures with just such a protrusion on their headgear. The middle figure is the Oba. The flanking chiefs are the ancestors of these two particular ones, Chief Osa and Oswan, who were the advisors of Oba Esigie in the in the 16th century and who steered him carefully through a civil war with his half-brother. They stand together in a triad position, which is one of the major motifs in Benin art, two chiefs supporting the Oba, and the chiefs, of course, represent not only themselves, but the whole of the Edo people who are behind the Oba. He can't move without their assistance. In fact, Barbara Blackman spoke of a quote regarding this, about how the Oba, in past times, asked his supporters who would help him carry the weight of the crown. And indeed, when we see the Oba dressed for the most important ceremonies in a whole gown of coral beads, a crown of coral beads, coral beaded shoes, and so forth, it's attire that weighs probably between 30 and 50 pounds, so some assistance is welcome. At the middle there, you can see an ivory, probably a 19th century ivory, a waist pendant, that shows that same kind of arrangement, and there the protrusions that prove that these are the same chiefs are present. The one on the left is our plaque, the other from the Peabody at Harvard that we hope to borrow. They both show an important chief in the middle, surrounded by an entourage. Hieratic scale is at work, so the chief himself is not only centrally placed, but he's much larger than the other figures. And in fact, rank on the one on the left is very much determined by size. There are some very small figures down here, and above, musicians, tiny musicians, medium-sized accessory holders, and much larger warriors flanking this central figure. And this concept of entourage is even one that's operative on the Oba's altars, where statues of courtiers, not just statues of the Oba himself, but of various courtiers, were placed on ancestral altars to provide him with an image of entourage throughout the ages. Coral beads are very, very important in Benin, as are red stone beads, chalcedony. The red stone beads are darker, they're older. The coral beads were one of the main exports the Portuguese, or the main imports for the Edo people, from the Portuguese. And from the beginning, their novelty as a red bead, but a brighter red bead and a more expensive one because it was imported, that novelty factor was important in display, and Edo men vied for them. They were the privilege of the Oba to give out, and they are still very, very expensive. The bracelet you see on the right is made out of ivory. For most of Benin's history, ivory was the privilege of the Oba alone. But there was a point in the 17th and 18th century where there was so much of it available, and some of the Obas were not so strong, that certain of the big chiefs had ivory bracelets. And so we're seeing one of those here. This particular one is showing the figure from an earlier era. It's an 18th century bracelet, but it shows a 16th century Portuguese figure, and he's actually holding bunches of beads in his hand. This is another of our plaques. You might see that the chest of this particular individual looks rather oddly swollen at the top. He represents a particular kind of courtier called an otun, and these individuals had chests that bulged because under their gown they kept a particular object. What was it? Well, this group, when the Agaivo Nore die, there are certain operations that were formerly, and whether they are still done, it's not the kind of thing one can delicately ask. I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm an art historian. But when Agaivo Nore members died in the past, their lower jaw was taken from the body, and when it was bone alone, it was given to these men to wear under their clothing when they were in royal processions, to remind the Agaivo Nore members who were living that the part of them that argued with the Oba was now the Oba's property. This is a bronze staff, a rattle staff, of a type that's normally made of wood and normally placed on ancestral altars. Everyone's ancestral altars. Only the Oba has certain types of imagery, and only the Oba ever has bronze or ivory examples, although most of his examples are wood too. You can see at the top is the figure of an Oba standing on top of an elephant. And this particular work has been researched by Paula Ben Amos, by Susan Vogel, and others, and it is a reference to an Oba in the 18th century whose father had been troubled by a rebellious member of that class of chiefs. And the chief had caused a civil war that continued into the son's reign. Finally, that chief, that rebel, his back was broken, so to speak, and he was represented by the elephant. So seeing the Oba here standing on the elephant is a reference to that victory, and it was a very critical victory. It's one that is referred to in other artworks. This is a Berlin altarpiece. You can see that the Oba in this work is holding that very staff. And it is the very staff because it has one elephant here and another below. You can't see the second one on this example, but it's referred to again in an artwork as an example of conquest and victory in a period where the Obas were just re-seizing power after the 17th century when it had been diminished quite a bit. That kind of history of struggles of various kinds is repeated over and over again, struggles with high-ranking chiefs, if you read recorded oral histories or listen to them. Here, one of our pieces, we have a wooden version of this same uhore, where the Oba stands atop the elephant. It is a very unusual motif, and in fact, we have not only this example, but a very rare example that shows a highly stylized elephant by itself without any figure atop.
You also talk about, the Benin Kingdom having changed very little. Is there a particular pride that must be there in the area because of that?
Yes, Benin is known all over the world as the strongest traditional people. They are still very traditional. They keep all their laws. All the things that went back in 14th, 13th centuries, they are still in place.
I'd just like to say that, in Nigeria, during the period she was talking about, there were, Nigeria was divided into various regions. You had the Sokoto Caliphate, the northern part of Nigeria, which is predominantly Hausas and Nupes. And you had, in the west, you had the Yorubas, the Oyo Kingdom, which was a very powerful and strong kingdom in the west at that time. The Benin Kingdom was in the Midwestern region. The person who founded the Warren Kingdom was, a prince, from the Benin Kingdom that moved away during the period that there were intertribal and civil wars within that kingdom. He moved away, for his safety, and his followers moved with him, traveled along the coastal region and settled in the present-day Warri area, and he founded that Benin. So there were different kingdoms at that time. The Benin people, the Benin Kingdom was a very prominent and powerful kingdom, and the Benin Kingdom has retained most of its, cultural values, both in terms of religious symbols, what the kingship meant to the people. There's a strong unifying force there between, the kingship, the kingdom, the Obas, and the people that they represent, because the Oba was a very powerful ruler, not just politically, but spiritually. The Benin people were known craftsmen. They were very good craftsmen and good brass work. And most of the artifacts, a lot of the artifacts that were carted away from Nigeria, and brought to the museums, which we find in different parts of Europe and America today, actually, most of this came from the Benin Kingdom, the Benin and the Oyo Empire.
Overall view of the Benin Kingdom. The year is 1501. The great kingdom then was ruled by Oba Ozuluwa, a powerful and wise man. Benin Kingdom then was rich in art and culture. Bronze plates, gold carvings, and the terracotta were the prime highlights of the day. The city was far developed ahead of its time, but this was said about the city of Benin then. Quote, "Many towns and an infinity of villages, the capital city itself being enclosed on one side by a wall 10 feet high. The king's palace is on the right side of town, being a collection of buildings which occupy as much space as the town of Haarlem, with numerous apartments and fine galleries, most of which are as big as those on the Exchange in Amsterdam. The whole town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and 120 feet wide, apart from an infinity of small intersecting streets. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards to cleanliness." End quote. Dutch geographer Olfert Dapper on Benin in Descriptions of Africa, 1668. The Benin Kingdom was a center of ritual activity focused on the well-being and prosperity of the Edo people. Each year, the Oba, or King, of Benin performs in rituals in which he honors his royal ancestors to enhance the good fortune of his people. One important ceremony, Igu, centers on the Oba's mystical powers, which are then demonstrated in a subsequent ritual, Imobo, whose main purpose is for the Oba to drive away any evil forces. The Oba sits in a red pavilion, red being a threatening color to help force away evil. Later, he dances with an ivory gong, striking it to repel malevolent forces. Idia was born in the area of Isi in Benin Kingdom. Her parents never wanted her to marry the Oba, a very beautiful woman whose beauty was marred by an herbalist by 2 large incisions on her head. The incisions were meant to disfigure her, but this became the main source of attraction and respect from Oba Ozuluwa. Oba Ozuluwa died after a peaceful reign. He left the kingdom in the hands of his wife and his 2 sons, one a warrior giant, and the other the Portuguese baptized Osawe, also known as Isigi. The quest for a new Oba of Benin had begun. The wisest and most powerful one will rule the kingdom. With the help of Idia, who mobilized an army around Isigi, he went on to defeat his brother. Oba Isigi became the 16th king of Benin. His brother then later went to rule Udo, which was about 20 miles away from Benin. In 40 BC, a man named AJERO was chosen amongst 4 elders. It was these people that came to be known as kingmakers in later days. The AJERO family is one of the largest corporate families in Benin Kingdom. The family has been known as the defender of the kingship. After the barbaric tradition of killing the king's mother was successfully abolished by Isigi, his mother was restored back to the palace, and there she was crowned the Queen Mother. She became the first Ioba. After Oba Isigi became the Oba of Benin, the city witnessed rapid growth and stronger relationship between the Portuguese. During this period, the Benin Kingdom was witnessing several invasions from his neighboring Igala peoples. Most of the battles she, Idia, went and fought like a man. There were situations she would dress like a man in battles. The battles she didn't fight, her military council brought victory to the throne. Even when assassination attempts were made against the throne, Queen Mother Idia, through her powers, protected her son and kept the unity of the city. As time went on, Benin Kingdom witnessed a lot of developments under the reign of Queen Idia. Trade, arts, and commerce were the pride of the day. Under her reign, the kingdom witnessed advent of the missionaries into the region. It was said she ruled and established a royal court that will go on par with that of Queen Elizabeth I and that of Queen Candace of Ethiopia, who reigned at the time of Christ. Such grace and style with one woman. Apart from her military strength and her ability to make the land prosper through different sources of commercial activities, she was also seen as a spiritual figure during festivals held in the kingdom. Idia's social and cultural accomplishments, such as her invention of the Akasa dance for royal funerals and the creation of the parrot's beak or Ioba's cap, have been recorded in numerous writings. A great woman of power, she was known to have possessed great physical and spiritual strength. Hence, she was the only one that could wield the double-edged sword that could both recreate or wreak havoc. According to the royal bards, on her head was a distinctive coral war crown peculiar to her alone. Resting on her forehead was a charm with 4 cowries that ensured any oncoming stone or missile will not blind her. On the back of her head was the charm known as a boomerang. On her neck was a precaution rope with 4 leopard teeth tied to it. The rope reminded her to be careful and to avoid danger. On her chest was a day belt, designed to ensure that whatever the nature of the problem, dawn will always come. Hidden under it was the belt of dumbbells used to hypnotize and frighten her enemies. The Ada soldiers on this day were on their way to invade Benin. Ioba Idia and her son Isigi marched into battle. As they were approaching the battlefield, the abyss, conceived as a bird of prophecy, flew over the soldiers marching to battle, shrieking and flapping its wings. The royal diviners predicted military disaster and urged retreat, but resolute Idia drew upon her strength and reputation. The rattled royal diviners predicted military disaster and urged retreat, but resolute Idia drew upon her strength and reputation and supernatural powers and neutralized the prediction of defeat. Closely heeding to the counsel of his mother, who was on the battlefield with her own army, Isigi ordered the bird to be shot. Fortified by her powerful presence and at her urging, Isigi rallied his dispirited soldiers to a victorious battle. After a long reign of great accomplishment and battles won, the great Ioba Idia passed on to the great beyond. Isigi was devastated by his mother's death. In her memory, he ordered the ivory tusks and masks he commissioned to immortalize her. Bereft of his mother's strength, Oba Isigi turned to his favorite wife, Alaba, whom Idia must have groomed for his comfort and to be his confidant. The death of Idia paved the way for Alaba to become the next dominant female in the region. She accompanied Isigi to many battles, and whatever crisis he faced, she faced with him.
You might wonder what it really means to be a chief. This is a word that's used in different aspects throughout Africa. Sometimes a chief is a ruler, depending on which part of Africa we're talking about. At other times, he is a titled person who has no governmental capability and never did. And in a case like Benin, he is really at the service and assistance of the king. So the chiefs have varied duties, as we'll see, but they work for the king. They are his representatives, they are his workers, they are his counselors, depending on which kind of title they hold. Benin has different kinds of chiefs. Some birth orders stick you with a chieftaincy. That is, if you have a certain type of title, you will be a chief if you are the oldest son, no matter what. But actually, those titles are in the minority. Most titles are awarded. So we have past and present here. On the right, one of the current chiefs with a hairstyle that is exclusive to them, as long as they still have hair. And on the left, on one of our tusks, a chief in very high status attire indeed. All chiefs are not equal, however. Just because you're a chief does not mean you're wealthy. And it doesn't mean that you are particularly well known or, well, you are considered to be more important than a commoner, but there are vast differences, as you can see in the interior of these two chiefs' homes. These are photographs taken in the same year. On the left, we have a chief who has actually an altar with objects that many collectors would find to be to prove his wealth to the extreme. On the right, one of the most, one of the wealthiest men in Benin. The chiefs are divided into a couple of different categories, and these categories prescribe what they do, but also something of the influence that they have. There are over 300 chiefs working for the Oba today. And Benin is not a huge polity. I mean, there are are just over 1 million Edo in the core Benin Kingdom, not counting the northern Edo and some of the associated groups. Let's just take a quick look at the differences between or amongst these groups. The Uzama, there are only 7. They are the descendants of a group of men who assisted the first dynasty before the 14th century. They have hereditary titles, they have their own neighborhoods in the city, and some of them have markets named after them or special privileges that their ancestors inherited. Privileges of jurisdiction, of dress, of owning objects that no one but the Oba can own normally. They've had also a history of major conflicts with kings in the past. And this gets into some of our tensions because these are not only remembered by historians and ordinary people for that matter, but they are reenacted in some of the palace ceremonies. So major conflicts in the 16th century, in the 18th century, and their power was eroded at each point of conflict. So today, their role is mostly ceremonial. They're vital to certain celebrations at the palace because they are reenacting their historic role. The Agaivo Nore are the highest ranking group of chiefs. There are about 28 titles now. And I should say that the Oba is free at any time to invent new titles or to abandon old ones. So the numbers of titles become fluid. These men are usually self-made men and wealthy. And in the past, they were the generals. They had to have a lot of influence because there was no standing army. Each general was expected to raise his own army, so they had to be popular and have a lot of young men who flocked to them and were interested in their leadership. And of course, they were often interested in their leadership because of a series of favors that had been done for them. They act as counselors to the Oba today. They often, because of their position in business or other parts of the political and social worlds of Nigeria, know people. They're close to governors. They might be close to the head of state. They can advise the Oba on ways to interact with the rest of the country or outside the country. The royal rivals to the king, because there has been a history of struggles between certain chiefs and the Oba, usually come from this group because of the very influence that they acquire. And most of their titles are non-hereditary. Occasionally an Oba has gifted one of these chiefs by allowing his title to be inherited, but it's fairly rare. The Agaivo Nogbe are the third group of chiefs. There are about 289 of them. They form the bulk of this group, and they're involved mostly with palace, daily, and ritual life. A lot of them are drawn from the guilds because Benin has a system whereby there are hereditary groups that produce objects for the Oba or do particular things for the Oba, royal guilds. And a lot of them have chiefs within their ranks, sometimes more than one, depending on the size of the guild. More of the hereditary titles are in this group than in either of the others. And even within this very large group, there are subdivisions. It's interesting just how much the Obas, past and present, have kept information, vital information, about how things work, ritually and otherwise, out of the hands of everyone. Bits and pieces belong to each group. In fact, the three groups, Iwebo, Iwegwe, and Ibiwe, are only allowed access to certain parts of the palace. So an Ibiwe member can never wander into an Iwebo room, for instance. They all have their own quarters and passages and so forth, and their own secrets. Iwebo is the most important and senior group. They're in charge of the Oba's regalia, his coral beads, his dress, his ivories, etc. They're in charge of the music that's performed at festivals. The artists and craftsmen come from this group. And formerly, they were the group in charge of foreign trade, which made them a wealthier group indeed. Iwegwe is a group that is primarily concerned with the Oba's personal well-being. They do the divination for him. They are involved with ritual purity, also physical and spiritual healing. The sword bearers, the bodyguards, and the ancestral records are cared for by this group. Ibiwe is concerned with the harem. Today the Oba has 4 wives, but in the past, if we talk about the 18th century, for instance, or previous, 400 would be more the norm, but today 4. But the Ibiwe group still is concerned with the care of the harem and with the royal children. At least 63 of the 334 titles are hereditary, but if you didn't inherit your title, as most chiefs did not, there are a lot of stages involved with becoming a chief. First of all, even getting an offer involves either the Oba deciding you deserve an honor, or more likely, you intimate that you wouldn't mind having one, which means you already have to have connections within the palace and let that word get out, that should he so honor you, you wouldn't throw it over your shoulder. The chiefs, once the Oba has decided, yes, indeed, he's going to do it, he sends a number of chiefs to your house at night. And he decides that you are worthy of the honor, and if you are smart, you will accept it. You wait a few days, and then you officially pay him a courtesy call to thank him for this gift. And you're dressed very simply at this point. You can see these 2 men in white. Only one is getting a title, the other is accompanying him. And this is done without drumming, without much fanfare. It's just a simple acceptance. You then have to pay fees to your class of chiefs, whether you're an Agaivo Nore, Agaivo Nogbe, etc., and they share out that money. That is a very important part of getting the title. And if you stick at this point, there are certain things you'll be ineligible to do until such time as you've paid. About 3 months later, at least 3 months later, the Oba will call you to come to the palace to confirm your title. This is called come to the gates of glory. That's what is said to these would-be chiefs.
Despite its obvious beauty and complexity, it has been widely held in Europe that African art is in some way primitive. Many Europeans judged it purely on aesthetic grounds, rather than attempting to understand its social and cultural context. African art simply did not fit into the rigid and formal categories that dominated Western art theory. Yet ironically, it was the profound values of African art which brought about a major change in a group of European artists at the beginning of the 20th century. Dr. Pogoson.
The artists were revolting at that time. They wanted to break away from the strict traditions of naturalism. The camera had come, and so they couldn't compete with it because it would give you direct images, and so there was a revolt among artists. They wanted to move on, and so people like Picasso started to break down human forms from what they were in the past, natural, into cubes, and that's how Cubism started. And so it's a motivation from the African wood sculptures.
In 1907, the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso visited the Ethnographic Museum at the Palais du Trocadero in Paris, where he underwent a transforming experience.
When I went to the old Trocadero, it was disgusting. The smell. I was alone. I wanted to get away, but I didn't leave. I stayed. I understood that it was very important. Something was happening to me, right? The masks weren't just like any other pieces of sculpture. Not at all. They were magic things. I understood what the Negroes use their sculptures for. They were weapons, to help people avoid coming under the influence of spirits again, to help them become independent.
Picasso described African art as a form of magic, a mediator between this strange, hostile world and us. One significance of this recognition was that artifacts from the continent were no longer to be judged in the court of Western art. They could continue to speak for themselves, as they had spoken to Africans for generations.
In the 19th century, the British saw the kingdom as an opportunity to extend their influence in Africa. They established a trade agreement, but when Benin reneged on it, relations deteriorated. A British delegation ignored warnings not to approach the Oba and were massacred, leaving just 2 survivors from over 200 people. A month later, in February 1897, 1,200 British soldiers arrived in response. The city walls didn't stop the British punitive expedition, and the city was razed to the ground. At the Royal Palace, they found artwork that they couldn't believe had been created by Africans. Around 2,000 pieces were taken, sold, and distributed to Western museums. The Oba was deposed and died in exile. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Kingdom of Benin.
In January 1897, the vice-consul of a British trading settlement on the coast decided to visit the Oba. The Oba had recently accepted a trading agreement with the British, but he wasn't keeping it. No palm nuts or palm oil were coming out of his territory, so the Oba had to be reprimanded. The traditional way to reach the city was to travel up the mangrove-lined creeks of the Niger Delta to the village of Ugoton, which marked the frontier with the Benin Kingdom. Messengers had been sent ahead by canoes with gifts to tell the Oba that the British vice-consul proposed to visit him. But as they travelled upriver, they met messengers on their way back with a reply. The Oba did not wish to see the British at this particular time. The party reached Ugoton on the afternoon of January the 3rd. On the way up, they had been collecting carriers, and now they had the 240 men that they needed to carry all their supplies. But here there were more messages from the Oba telling them not to come. The local people gave them vehement warnings. It would be very unwise to go to Benin now, they said, for the Oba was celebrating Igwe. Igwe was and is the most important of all Benin rituals. It was last held in 1964 when these pictures were taken. During it, the Oba salutes the shrines of the earlier god kings, his ancestors, and renews his divine power. In 1897, as in previous years, the climax of Igwe was to be the sacrifice of a man. It may be that the Oba was trying to prevent the British vice-consul from seeing these grisly rites. At any rate, his messengers did their best to persuade the British to delay, if only by a few days. But Vice-Consul Phillips was not to be put off, and with his British companions and 240 carriers, he left Ugoton at 7 o'clock on the morning of the next day, January the 4th. This is the path they took. It is so thin and narrow that they had to march in single file. Europeans and Africans were slaughtered indiscriminately. Only 2 Europeans escaped. The Benin warriors hunted them through these thick forests and came within yards of them several times. They had nothing to eat, and the only thing to drink was the dew from the leaves. One of them was badly wounded, but after 5 days they reached the river. The wounded man's arm had already turned gangrenous. Both their bodies were black with thorns. The news of the massacre had gone ahead of them, and on January the 11th, only 7 days after the massacre, it was in London. A punitive expedition had to be mounted. The British government summoned ships from the Cape and the Mediterranean. Marines were dispatched from England. By the first week of February, 1,500 men had begun the march on Benin. The battle was fierce, but inevitably short. The Bini tribesmen had no chance against Maxim guns and rockets. On February the 18th, after 4 days of sporadic fighting, and only 6 weeks after the massacre, the British took Benin City. In the abandoned palace, the victorious soldiers found wonders and horrors. The victors posed for their photographs in the palace courtyards. Stacked behind them, objects from the palace shrines that they were to bring back to Britain, either as personal souvenirs or official booty. There was an astonishing number. Sculptures of ivory, wooden masks, huge elephant tusks, covered along their length with elaborate scenes. But above all, there were bronzes.
By the late 1890s, the British colonial leadership in Benin was anxious to bring the kingdom under the authority of the British Niger Coast Protectorate and increase the profits for British merchants. Acting Consul General James Phillips sent this dispatch to the British Foreign Office.
I am certain there is only one remedy, and that is to depose the King of Benin. And I'm convinced that pacific measures are now quite useless, and that the time has now come to remove the obstruction. I do not anticipate any serious resistance from the people of the country. There is every reason to believe they would be glad to get rid of their king.
Phillips ignored warnings not to enter Benin during sacred religious ceremonies barred to outsiders, and sent a party of British officials towards the city, where they were ambushed and killed. Ignoring the fact that they had violated the Oba's rituals, the British took their revenge by pounding Benin with Maxim guns, sending the Oba into exile, and looting hundreds of priceless objects. As a result of this assault on Benin's sovereignty, many such artifacts were transported to Europe and sold on the open market.